What is hoisting in JavaScript? Hoisting is a popular concept which you may find in some programming languages, including JavaScript. But what does this concept even mean? In this video, using examples, I'll be simplifying the concept of hoisting in JavaScript. So what is hoisting? Hoisting in JavaScript is a concept where the interpreter would hoist or raise or lift the functions or variables or classes created in the code to the top of the scope that they were created in before that code would be executed. So this makes it possible for such functions or classes or variables to be accessible even before the line where they were declared. Now, what do I mean by all of this? Let's look at some examples. So here we have a function code, we have a variable with var, a variable with let, a variable with const, and a class declaration. Let's start from functions. So here we have function print hello, and let's say this function simply does console log hello. Now, if I come down here and I try to access print hello, if I come here and I run this file, you see it works, right? Because we are trying to access or use this function after we have declared it. But what if we try to access it even before? Let's put it at the top like this. If I run this here, you can see it still works. What happens here is hoisting. So before the interpreter executed all of this code here, it first hoisted the print hello function to the top. In this case, print hello is defined in the global scope, so this will be hoisted to the top of the global scope. Now let's say I have another function here inside the print hello, which I'll call print Deeecode, and here we simply do console log Deeecode. The scope for print Deeecode is local to this function, so this will be hoisted to the top of the function. It will not be hoisted to the top of the global scope. So let's say here we try to access print Deeecode. If I come here and I press this now, you see we have print Deeecode is not defined. But if I put print Deeecode to the top of print hello here, which is the local function in which print Deeecode is defined, if I come back here and I try to access print hello, if I run this here, you can see that by executing print hello, this is hoisted to the top of the global scope, so we can access print hello. And on executing this function, this executes print Deeecode, which we are trying to access even before line 12 where we actually declared it. But hoisting makes that possible. So here we have Deeecode, and then console log hello, we have hello. So you can see how hoisting works. Print hello is hoisted to the top of the global scope. Print Deeecode is hoisted to the top of the local scope, which makes it possible for us to access those functions even before the line where we actually declared them. Now let's move further to variables. We'll start with the variables declared with var. Here we have var name equals Deeecode. If we try to access name here and we run this file, everything works because we are trying to access the variable after we have declared it. But let's say we try to access this at the top just before name. If we run this here, you see now we have undefined. Now when you declare variables with var, those variables are hoisted to the top of the scope that they are declared in. So name will be hoisted to the top, but it will be hoisted with a default value of undefined. As we saw in functions, the function is hoisted to the top with the logic, right? But when you use var, this will be hoisted without the value. So that's why we have undefined. But if we come down here and we try to access the name variable, you see first we have undefined coming from here, and now we have Deeecode coming from here. So at this point, name is hoisted with the default value of undefined. But here we now initialize the value of Deeecode to that variable, and now accessing it now gives us Deeecode. The same thing applies if it's a function. Let's say we have a function called print variable, and in this function I'm just going to move all of this here. Now if I try to access name from the top here, you see we have name is not defined. So remember, the variable will be hoisted to the top of the scope that it is declared in. In this case, name is hoisted to the top of print variable. So I'm just going to clear this line, and let's say I access print variable here. As you remember, this is possible because print variable is hoisted to the top of the global scope. So now if I run this, you see again hoisting happens locally. We try to access this, name is hoisted with a default value of undefined, and we try to access it here. Now we get Deeecode. Now let's move on to the other keywords for declaring variables. Let's move on to let. So now we have this variable name declared with the let keyword. Let's try to access it at the top. We know it's going to be hoisted, right? But let's try to access it. we now have an error. Now if you notice, this error does not say name is not defined. It actually acknowledges that name is defined, but the error says cannot access name before initialization. So what does this mean? Name is actually hoisted, but it is not hoisted with a default value. When we used var, if you remember, it was hoisted with a default value, and that's why we had undefined. But with let, it does not have a default value. That's why it says you cannot access it before initialization. But if I bring name down here, just after the line it was declared, if I come here and I run this, you see everything now works. If you're curious to know why there's a strike through on this name, it has something to do with some global name that is deprecated. But here I'm not trying to access the global name, I'm trying to access this variable, so you can just ignore that strike through. Let's move forward to const variables. Actually, const variables are similar with let variables in their hoisting behavior. So if we try to access name here again and I run this, you see it says cannot access name before initialization. So name is actually hoisted, but just like we saw in let, it is not hoisted with a default value, and that is why you have cannot access before initialization. But if I bring name down here and I run my console now, you see everything works. Remember, the same thing applies if it is in a function. If I declare name in a function, it will be hoisted to the top of the function. Let's even try that out. So I'm not just saying anything. I'll come here, paste this. So here I'll use const. I'm going to take this line off. So now if I try to access name and I run this, you see it says name is not defined, which means JavaScript does not know of any name variable, and that is because we declared name in a function, so it will only be hoisted to the top of that scope. It will not be hoisted to the top of the global scope. But if I take this out and now let's say I call this function print variable like this, come here, clear the console. If I run this, you see we now have an error, cannot access name before initialization. So name is hoisted to the top of the local scope, but it doesn't have a default initialization. But if I take off that line and I come here and I run this now, you see we now have Deeecode. Now let's move on to classes. So here we have a class animal with a constructor that expects a name argument, and then we call the this, which would reference the object that is instantiated from this class, and on the name property of that object we assign this name argument. So let's come down here and quickly instantiate a dog from this animal class. So we have new animal, and then we pass the argument of bingo. Let me just come here and console.log dog. If I come here and run this, you see everything works well. We have the animal class which dog is instantiated from, and we have the name property as bingo. But let's say we take this to the top here. Let's see what happens here. Cannot access animal before initialization. So what does this mean? It means that here we are trying to access animal. JavaScript acknowledges that there is an animal class in the global scope, and that is because the class is hoisted. But just like we saw with let and with const, you cannot access or use such classes before you actually initialize them. Let me quickly do this again for the animal. So I have this function. I'll just call this print object, uncomment it, and I'm going to move all of this inside here, and let me just call print object like this, and let me try to use it like this. So if I come here, clear this, and I run this, you can see animal is not defined. Because we declared this class inside this function, it will only be hoisted to the top of the local scope. That is where it was declared in. So it will be hoisted to the top of print object, and that is why it is currently not defined. But if I bring this from here and I put it inside here like this, and I take this from here and I put it inside here, now if I come here and I run this file, now we have cannot access animal before initialization. You see up here we have animal is not defined because we're trying to access it from a scope that it wasn't defined in. But when we try to access it in the local scope, now we have a new error, cannot access animal before initialization. That is because animal is hoisted but without a default initialization. So if I take this from the top now, bring it to the bottom, clear the console and run this again, you now see we have just what we want. So as you see with hoisting makes it possible for you to access functions, variables, and classes before the line that they were actually declared in the code, but there are different behaviors. With functions, the function is hoisted and you can use it without any error. With var, the variable is hoisted but with the default value of undefined, so you would not know what the actual value is until you come to the actual line of initialization. With let, the variable is hoisted but without the default initialization, initialization. Const, the same thing. With classes, the same thing. So this is what hoisting means in JavaScript. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like, share, and also subscribe for more concepts or behaviors that I will be simplifying in JavaScript on my channel.